Well, last month I spent a few weeks in Melbourne, Australia, and an unexpected thing happened to me while I was there. I received an email from an old friend that I hadn't communicated with for years. So I was a little surprised. We'd had a falling out. We used to be really close, and then we had a disagreement, and we just kind of didn't communicate anymore after that. Anyway, she said in her email, I came across this friend who was someone who we both know, and she said, you're in town, and I'm coming into the city tomorrow. Do you want to have coffee together? And I thought, okay, I'll do that. And so we met at the cafe, and she told me a bit about what she'd been doing, and I told her what I'd been doing. It was all good. And eventually we left the cafe. She went her way, I went my way, and it was all nice, and I didn't really think about it after that. But then a few days later, it kept coming up for me, and I kept going over it, and I realized that there'd been a healing take place. And so often we think about healing as a physical thing. And the question I have for you today is, have you been healed lately? And maybe you've not even noticed it. But healing can happen in so many different ways. It can show up in relationship healing, just like the one I told you about just then. It can be emotional healing, when we're able to release some grief or anger or a bit of trauma about something. It can be mental healing, like when we can free ourselves from some old idea or some limiting belief. I used to think that to make money, you had to work really hard for it. And I started going to Unity, and I learnt the prosperity principles. And then I thought, maybe that's not a belief that's actually true. And I realized, you've got to get into the flow, and it's about the giving and the receiving. And once I got that idea, I really understood what this generosity of spirit meant, and the giving and the receiving. And I've never done a budget since then. So I've always been in that flow, but it's a freeing experience to let go of something you used to believe, and then you think, I don't think that's right for me anymore. And certainly there can be physical healings. If we think of our co-founder, Myrtle Fillmore, she didn't fight her illness, but she blessed her body. And she repeated those famous words, I'm a child of God, therefore I do not inherit sickness. She repeated that every day. She talked to her body, she blessed it, and she shifted her way of looking at her body. She wrote, I began to talk to my body and tell it was strong and well. I told every organ and every function of my body that it was made perfect. I asked forgiveness for the ignorant thoughts I'd held about it, and I blessed it. And then we have generational healing. Sometimes we get an ailment of some sort and we think, that makes sense. My grandfather used to have that. And I recall my grandmother used to have terrible varicose veins. She was actually a farmer, and she used to wear these really thick stockings, which I thought, as a child, that was very weird and very hot. And now I have a few varicose veins, and I think, that's right, I've got that from my grandmother. So we have a tendency to take on these weaknesses that we see in the family. We think, that's a trait that I've received from them. We see it sometimes in Indigenous cultures where, for instance, the stolen generation and that trauma from that is passed down through the generations. And we see it in the Holocaust generations. The children of today, or the grandchildren of the Holocaust survivors, they haven't experienced it, but they feel the trauma, and that's one of the hardest healings to fix. And then, of course, we have the healing of the nervous system, and that's a big one today because we live in this world where we can get pretty anxious sometimes. can be stressful for us. So we need to pay attention to that, to replenish our nervous system by doing peaceful things. And it might be that, we rest, we do meditation, we take a walk in nature. We all have our own peaceful thing. So we have to work at that to replenish the nervous system. And then there's what I call time healing. Have you ever looked back at something in the past and thought, why did I get so upset about that? It was a little bit how I felt when I met up with my friend. Like, I was so distraught at the time because we were super close, but I realized, well, it just didn't really matter anymore. And so we can look back in the past and see it in a different way, and that's kind of a healing. Louise Hay wrote that the body reflects our thought patterns, and every thought creates the future. And so she talked in her book about healing a lot. She said healing is never in the past. It's activated now, and it's in the present moment. And then, of course, the ultimate type of healing is spiritual healing, which is a big thing for us here. It's when we bring ourselves back to balance. We bring ourselves back to our true nature by restoring our wholeness. And this was a method that Jesus used often. He was always trying to get people to restore themselves to their wholeness. And he often said these words, "It's your faith that has made you whole." And a lot of people saw Jesus as the great healer. He said, no, it's not me. It's your faith that makes you whole, your faith that heals you. And there's a story about this in Mark 5. It says that a woman had been living with what the scripture describes as an issue of blood for 12 years. So I imagine she had some sort of hemorrhaging condition. And it was constant, she was exhausted, she was depleted, and in her culture, it meant that she was ritually unclean. So she couldn't go out in public. She had to live in isolation, and no one could physically touch her. And so for 12 years, she had been physically and emotionally cut off. And then one day, she hears that Jesus is coming to town. She thinks, I'm going to go and see. And she goes down there, and there's a big crowd, and she pushes her way through the crowd. And then she gets a kind of inner voice that says, if I touch his garment, I will be made whole. And the scripture says immediately, not gradually, not over time, immediately, the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed. And then something unexpected happens. Jesus turns around and he says, who touched me? And the woman comes forward and he says, daughter, your faith has made you whole. And so she'd been not just healed, she'd been made whole. But the most important thing about this story is that the woman has been isolated, and her touch was the connecting point. She was willing to reach out and make the connection. And when we make the connection, when we reach out, that's where the healing begins, in that first touch point. And so healing is never out there. It's in the moment of connection. But we must be willing to reach out and to have the faith to do it, not to stand back and watch, but to step into the healing. So have you reached out lately? Have you been willing to make a connection? To allow the healing process to work, we must first of all use our spiritual power to overcome fear. And sometimes we do have fear in reaching out. And I imagine, for instance, my friend back in Melbourne thought, should I do this or not? Should I send this email? You know, when your finger is just over the button to send, the send button. She probably thought, oh, that's it, and she sent it. So there's always a little bit of fear in the background there. But we can have mastery, we have creative power, and we can step forward and we can reach out. You know, a celebrity once said, after losing 80% of the money I earned, I decided to get up, dust off, and try it again. And so he really accepted this idea that God is my source, it doesn't matter what's happened, and he ended up making all of his lost money back and more. So there always is this opportunity for us to transform ourselves if we choose to do it. It is possible to live from faith rather than fear, knowing that God is always our source, always walking with us. And so we're going to say this affirmation together today. Together, I move forward with strength and will to do what is mine to do. Into Timothy, it says, "For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but the spirit of power and of love." And when Jesus was asked about the greatest commandment that one can live by, he said, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And it's a very interesting way that he says it, because he says it in order. He says you have to love the Lord your God first. That means you love your divine mind, your creative spirit, your creative center. And then you love others as yourself. And so love is never a separate thing. Well, I don't love myself, but I love this. It's not. It's all one thing. Reverend Sheila McKeithen wrote a book on healing. And in it she says, you love because you are too smart not to. Thank you. You love because you know that love is sufficient to see you through every adventure of life. And so we say together, I am worthy of healing. I accept my healing now. And there's one healing step that is often missed, and that is rest. In this busy world we live in, we sometimes have to be reminded of that. But rest is required for the life force within us to do its healing work. And in many faiths, it's called the Sabbath. So we can rest in many ways. We can rest from overthinking. That's really hard for some people. Just give my mind a rest for a minute. We can rest by releasing control of a situation. That's hard for some people. But we have to allow the mind to have time to reset itself and the body to replenish itself. In the Psalms it says, be still and know that I am God. And if you say that for yourself, be still and know that I am God. Think about those words. You're not saying it to someone out there, you're saying it to yourself. Be still and know that I am God. What do those words really mean to you? Because in your stillness is where your healing energy is at work. You can fill the whole body and the whole mind with it. And this is the natural work of the body to heal itself. And so we say together, I rest in the healing flow of divine spirit. I allow the life force to heal me. To have faith is to choose to trust life, even when the appearances look otherwise. Faith activates the healing already present. In Luke 17, it says, have faith the size of a mustard seed. Well, there's that mustard seed. We were talking about it the other week, this tiny little seed, and that's all you need. Just that little speck of faith to begin the healing work. A little bit like the woman who touched Jesus' garment. It was just a little mustard seed of faith, a tiny bit of faith. We may not know what type of help we need, but the higher power does. We may not even know if we're going to make it through, but the higher power does. And we may feel afraid, but it's the higher power that gives us courage. We may feel on our own, but the higher power is always with us. And so we say together, my faith in the goodness makes me whole. We are healing when we set aside our fears and show courage. We're healing when we see ourselves and others with more compassion. We're healing when we rest without guilt. We're healing when we have trust in the process. And we're healing when we're willing to reach out to touch the garment. And these are all the ways that we invite our healing in. So have you been healed lately? Maybe not in the way you expected. There is a presence within you that is always restoring, always renewing, and always making itself whole. And that's because life is committed to your wholeness. Do you know that as a truth? Say, life is committed to my wholeness. Yes, and whether you see it or not, it's at work in you now. And so we say together, there is one life, whole and complete, and that life is expressing as me now. And so it is.